series and performance live streams that we do. Today we have the very good fortune and pleasure of having the recently retired but long-time hero of the Northwest radio music scene here for KNKX and all around, the great Dick Stein.
Oh.
Dick, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Before we get started, you know, all of us around the world have suffered tremendous losses in one way or another, and I'm sure you're aware of this, and if you're not, how much you mean to the community and you're beloved, whether you want to acknowledge that or not, or whether you realize that, but you've been a large part of this community for many, many years, and I myself as a musician and citizen can't thank you enough for all the work that you've done and what you mean to all of us. So hopefully you're aware of that.
Well, I am now. Honestly, I was really very much taken by surprise at the outpouring when we made the announcement from my coworkers at the station and from listeners. It really did take me by surprise. I just thought, so long, folks, happy trail. But it wasn't like that, and it was really, I was just overwhelmed.
Well, from my own perspective and personal experience, I remember when I first saw you in person, and I didn't know who Dick Stein was. I remember I used to work the door for my old teacher, Tracy Knope, at a club called The Drake that was down on Pack Ave in Tacoma, which is now Dorky's Arcade.
Yeah.
It's around the corner of 9th and Pack Ave.
I remember you used to go down there.
Yes, well, that's what I was going to say. I remember you, and I just remember thinking, who is this cool guy? Because you'd always walk in with a hat, and usually you were by yourself for the most part just to sit there and enjoy the music, and you'd take your hat off, and then you had a rag on underneath the hat, like a bandana of sorts. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but and really enjoying the jazz, and you knew all the musicians, and I just wondered who was that guy, and you were just really the energy that you brought to the room was very, very cool. And then
just sitting there,
you're just sitting there and enjoying the jazz. It was just I observed you doing that, and I was like, oh, that's a cool guy, And then later came to find out, oh, well, that's Dick Stein from, at the time, KPLU, which is now KNKX. So prior to that initial meeting of sorts, seeing you at Drake's, did you get out and frequent jazz clubs in Tacoma often, or not so much?
Yeah, I did. I can't really remember the timeline, whether Drake's was before or after. I like to go like to go to a Prosito on 6th Avenue, and, of course, to Red Kelly's joint. Used to love to see the Ramsey Cleve band there and listen to Red's terrible jokes. So, yeah, there was actually a pretty good jazz scene in Tacoma for quite a while.
But even at that time, so this would have been around 1996, 97, 98. That's when that kind of started for me, just being around and noticing that. But I was also impressed with how you knew all the musicians and the musicians knew you. And I mean, obviously, through radio and being on the scene. But did you get up to Seattle much to check out music as well, or not too much?
Yeah, so to Jazz Alley mostly, and some other places now and then. But I don't know how I came to know. I got to know the people in the Ramsey Cleve band pretty well because I was there all the time, and I knew Bill and had done I think a couple of things with SRJO, in live appearances. But yeah, I don't know, just how it is. You hang around long enough, you start to meet people.
Yeah, well, I also sticking out in my mind, just my personal memories of you. I remember I went to see one of my heroes at the time, still one of my heroes, Joshua Redman's band, and this was when he was touring in support of his Freedom in the Groove album.
Yeah.
And you introduced him. This was at the King Cat Theater in Seattle, which is no longer there. This was years ago, and I was like, oh, there's Dick Stein again, on the scene doing cool stuff in the community. So, always out and about in introducing artists, and I have questions about that that we'll get to later. But what I'd like to start with, I know you've done a couple interviews for like the TNT and also for KNKX, and hopefully I'm not redoubling back and redoing too much ground. But for those of you for those listening who don't know much about your history, can you talk a little bit about your upbringing and what got you into radio and music and all that kind of good stuff?
Well, I grew up pretty much in New Rochelle, New York, which is a suburb of New York City, about 20 minutes away. The old song, only 45 minutes from Broadway. And there was a lot of good radio on at the time, a lot of good jazz radio. And I used to listen to Billy Taylor, mostly on WLIB. And years and years in between songs, there'd be this piano music. And years and years and years later, I was fortunate enough to interview him. And I said, I used to love to listen to your WLIV show. And I always imagine you sitting there with a microphone at the piano, noodling away. And I said, now it's just a record. And Mark Vega, who called me up one time when I was on the air in our original studios when it was KPLU, and called up and said, hey, I just wanted to tell you, I think you're doing a great job. I really like the way you do your show. I used to do this kind of stuff too. You get calls like this sometimes. They were on college radio or whatever. And I said, oh, really? I said, would I know your name? Who are you? And he said, Mort Figa. I go, oh, my God, my hero, So that was really great. So listening to them, I used to love radio. I loved Bob and Ray on the radio and some other stuff. And I thought I'd like to do that. And in my high school yearbook, under what you want to do, it says radio announcer.
Well done.
So that was, I guess that was what put the radio bug in my head. I did a lot of other stuff and eventually wound up doing radio, a lot of commercial radio, top 40 and hard rock, country, all that, mostly in Alaska, in Anchorage. And the last 5 years I was doing a telephone talk show, a late-night telephone talk show, a pretty political one in 70s Anchorage. So that was lively. And that pretty much burned me out. And we moved down here to Tacoma. And I was done with radio, started a chimney sweeping business, which I actually did for about 10 years. But after a year or two, I started getting back into media, doing a lot of voiceover and production and a lot of copywriting, project management, and so on. And eventually, my wife, the lovely and talented Cheryl DeGroot, knew Nick Morrison, who happened to live across the street from us in Tacoma. And turned out they were looking for a part-timer, a fill-in guy at the station. And in all the radio I'd done, I'd never gotten to do jazz. And jazz was always my first love. And so I thought, well, you guys, I auditioned and, I got hired. And that was that. I used to go to a lot of jazz as a teenager in New York. You could get into Birdland at that time, underage, the original Birdland. You'd sit in the back. And I remember the first time I went with my best friend, a trumpeter named Frank DiGiacomo. And they put us it was called the Peanut Gallery. You'd go down, you'd buy a ticket, like a movie theater, And we were sitting in the back and, in our Slim Jim ties, and tab collar shirts. And we ordered Cokes. I got a 7-Up, Frank got a Coke. And they were $1 each. And we were, oh, geez. And so, yeah, we saw lots of great jazz. I mean, saw John Coltrane there and Getz and Gilberto and so many others. It was wonderful. So I'm digressing. But
No, this is all wonderful stuff. So I'm actually reading the book about Wayne Shorter right now, and he actually is talking about the club, and he actually mentions the Peanut Gallery and all that stuff.
Oh, did he? Really?
Oh, yeah.
Do you know, I get, what can you say on Facebook? I'm the last person on earth who doesn't have a Facebook.
You can say whatever you like. There may be children watching, but they can handle. So yeah, it's okay.
Well, anybody who's familiar with Birdland knows about their MC, Pee Wee Marquette, who was a little person. And was not well loved. People really hated him, and he, if you didn't tip him, he'd mispronounce your name on the bandstand. Maynard Ferguson told me about this stuff, and we were fabulous. We were Mad Dog Maynard Ferguson bands. It's during the roulette period when Jackie Byard was playing piano, and a lot of great players. Willie Maiden, Slide Hampton, doing arrangements and stuff. Can I tell? You probably know the Lester Young.
Please tell.
Okay, strong language. It's okay to do. Lester Young, who was as friendliest, everybody loved Lester Young, once said to him, "Get out my way, you half a motherfucker." And I was dying to tell the story on the air, but of course I never could.
Well, it's funny because I prior to reading this, right in the middle of this Wayne Shorter book called Footprints. I just finished Horace Silver's book, Let's Get to the Nitty Gritty.
Did you say Split Kick?
No, Horace Silver's book.
Okay.
And it's called Let's Get to the Nitty Gritty, and he actually tells that story in the
did
book.
he?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's a great story.
I'm sure it's a famous story.
Yeah. So, I wanted to ask you, with your parents and having that love of jazz at a young age, because some people do, some people don't. Did your parents enjoy music, and were they musicians? Or
They enjoyed music, but not jazz. My father was an early riser, and every morning, the apartment we lived in was, I think they're called shotgun apartments. They're just like this long kind of thing, and there's room. And my parents' and my sister's bedroom was on one end, and then there was like a living room and a kitchen, and I was all the way down on the other end in what in fancier times in this apartment had been the maid's quarters, and I was living down there. And my father was an early riser. He'd get up about 5 a.m, and he'd put on Al Jolson records. And that was all I heard, and the rest of it was, the usual stuff, Doggy in the Window and all that. My Uncle Paul, who was a jazz fan, gave me a whole box of 78s, which were outmoded even then. And that was my introduction to jazz. It was a Billie Holiday 78 with You Go to My Head. And on the back was The Moon Looks Down and Laughs. And I played that, and I was gobsmacked, as anyone would be. And I thought, I got to hear more of this. And then with my friend Frank, we just got into jazz, and we were terrible jazz snobs. I missed out on all the rock and roll of that period. I didn't discover the Beatles until like the White Album. I'm such a jerk. Now I have totally eclectic musical tastes.
That's funny that you mentioned that, because most musicians, when you talk about that, maybe I'm overgeneralizing, but many musicians you talk about, they like certain things, and then they get into jazz, and there's kind of this jazz snobbery that takes hold for a long period of time. And usually people mature out of that and start, getting wider palates and tastes for things. But it's funny to hear you, mention that.
Yeah, it really was. I had an inkling of like country music. There was, in the summer, I could pick up WWVA on the skip, it was called. And there was this DJ on there called himself, I can't remember his name, but he was great. And he called himself your coffee drinking Nighthawk. And I mean, this was like music from Mars, to this New York kid. But, it's funny. It seems to me that the musicians usually have far more eclectic taste, no matter what kind of a musician the public knows them as, whether they're jazz musicians or classical or country or what have you, rock and roll, usually have far more eclectic tastes than fans and listeners. And the fans are the snobby ones about music. And, really, it's all, there's so much great music of all kinds, as long as it's for real, the real thing, and not, this extruded music-like sound product that's pretty prevalent these days. So, yeah, I love all kinds of stuff. Cowboy music, everything.
Well, I should say, I think older cowboy music, country and or Western, is totally different than
totally. Yeah, I'm talking about roots stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of modern country is just pop with a cowboy hat.
True. That I think that feeling is shared by many. Okay. Did you at any point in your life ever play an instrument or attempt to play an instrument? Or?
Well, you can read a little bit about that. I wrote a reminiscence called Jackie Byard Calls BS, and you can find it online somewhere. That's the name of it. And it involved Jackie Byard calling BS on a really, really bad clarinet player. And in this description, I said, up until I heard this guy, I knew that I was the worst clarinet player on earth. And then I heard this guy. So yeah, I did play clarinet for a while. I was not very good at all. I mean, it was really bad. I never got past, beginner. I did play chromatic harmonica for quite a few years. I was better at that, but no, never really a musician.
So growing up in New York, was Minton's Playhouse around when you were going to see clubs, or had that come and gone?
I was certainly never there. I guess not. I don't think so. I tend to think of it as an historic place, which would be, something before my time.
The reason I ask is you talk about Jackie Byard calling BS, and I guess from what I've read and from what I understand, that room was a room where if you were not playing well, the musicians would let you know about it and call you out in the bandstand.
Yeah.
I guess
like
I should,
the Apollo.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I guess I should ask is, being in New York when you were there, did you ever see any of that go down?
The story they wrote about Bayard and the clarinet player, it was a clarinet duo. Was at a place called the Dom in the Lower East Side, and I was there just before heading to the West Coast to head up to Alaska. I was in the Air Force at that time, and I was going to a remote site in the Bering Sea. So it was my last gasp of civilization, you know, before heading for I would call it the woods, but there were no trees on that island. And I guess I'll tell a little bit of the story. People can read it, or even hear an audio production they made of it. Bayard was there with, I think it was just a trio. It was Bayard and a clarinet, a saxophonist you may know named Clarence Sharp, C Sharp, and I think they had a bassist. It was a trio, and during the break, this other duo got up, clarinet and drummer. He just had a snare, and it was just excruciating. And I'm sitting, you know, it was this, you know, fourth stream jazz or whatever. And I'm sitting there. Clarence had come to sit at our table near the stage. It was not much of a stage, just a little dais. And we were, you know, rolling our eyes at each other. But looking around the room, I noticed, you know, all these hipsters are going, oh, yeah, you know, and it's just this shrieking and squawking. It was just terrible. And, I mean, this is where Mr. Squeaky got his name, you know, from this guy. And I immediately, you know, could tell, you know, they're not getting this. There's nothing to get. But they thought, wow, this is so hip, you know. I better act like I'm really, you know, digging it, man, and all that. So after about 5 minutes of this, from the bar where Bayard was having a drink, and it was a small room, too, comes, what the fuck is this? You know, so that stopped everything. It was, you can almost hear the gasp, the collective gasp. And the guy said, I'm just playing my music, man. He said, that's not music. You can't play that thing at all. And he said, well, you know, maybe you're not. I can't remember his exact words, but it was like, maybe you just can't dig these advanced musical concepts, man. This is Jackie Bayard, you know, okay, who knew advanced musical concept pretty well, you know, and to say the least. And he said, oh, bullshit. You can't even play a 12-bar blues. I'll even comp you. And he goes to the piano, and he starts, you know, according away. And then the guy sounded just like I would have, you know, this painful, you know, squeak, squawk, squeak. And so then the crowd turned on him. And it was like, I didn't know whether to feel sorry for the guy or feel smug about it. But they actually, literally, the snare player took off right away, booed him out of the room, okay, out of the room. So it was kind of awful. But then on the other hand, you know, if you can't play your instrument, do you really want to play on the offset for Jackie Bayard in an actual club in New York? So, you know.
I've been doing this for a long time, and I've seen many things.
Have you?
Yeah,
similar
similar to that.
Well, there's a great Marion McPartland story. Can we go off?
Please. Yeah, of course.
We're just along those same lines. I was sitting at the bar at Jazz Alley when she was there talking with her bass player, whose name I can't remember. And I had never met Marion or spent any time with her other than introducing her, you know, for that show. And like everybody else, I'd always thought, you know, I thought of her as this genteel English lady, never stopping to realize that for any woman, especially with an English accent, coming up on 52nd Street in New York in the 40s and 50s, you know, you wound up pretty salty. And so I was talking with the bassist about that. He said, oh, yeah, you know, she's pretty salty. And he told me the story. I think it was in San Francisco. They were on their way to the gig. I don't remember where. But apparently the manager or the owner of this club always wanted to play with musicians, and he was terrible. I don't even know what it was he played. And Marion, in that posh, you know, Brit accent says, yes, and if you don't let him sit in, the motherfucker pouts. I raised money for the station in a fund drive by saying, I can't tell the story on the air, but if you send in $50 as a pledge, I will record the story and send it to you as an MP3 and an email. And we got a lot of money for it. Yeah.
Well, yes, and I've got tons of questions that I've written down.
Okay.
But we can totally go off all this. But
Okay.
what I wanted to ask you is going back to your early influences, because just like a musician, that makes who you are today and who you were / are as a radio host. I mean, your tastes obviously become, prevalent in your work over the years. So your first album that you really struck you was a Billie Holiday album. Who were some of the
Well, it wasn't even an album. It was a
78. Who
yeah.
were some other artists that you were drawn to in your initial dealings with jazz?
Initially, I think it was a Maynard Ferguson band that I mentioned before. My friend, there was a theme park called Freedom Land out in, I think it later became Shea Stadium. I'm not sure of that. And my friend Frank, who was a trumpeter, and I and a couple of other guys were going out there one time. We actually rode our bicycles up the New York thruway to get there. And we were going to go hear Maynard Ferguson. We were like 14 or 15 because we thought his name was funny, So we got there, and I mean, that band was unbelievable. It was just wham, and Maynard, And so, Maynard Ferguson, and then the band hit it, and we go, whoa, So we were buying up every Maynard record we could find. As I said, this was in the roulette years. He had another great saxophonist named Willie Maiden on there, and so that was the first one. And then I guess right after that, at some point along the way, I discovered bebop, and of course, most of the music I was being exposed to was listening to the radio, and went out and bought albums. And I had all this other crazy stuff, like I think it might have been Dick Hyman. I don't hold me to this, but there was a pianist, like this honky-tonk piano kind of guy, with a prepared piano that called himself Knuckles O'Toole, who I thought was his real name, but I think it might have been Dick Hyman who was doing that, playing this great, two-fisted piano. If it wasn't him, it was someone else. So I liked that, and I couldn't really say. I just started. One thing led to another. I don't think there was any particular album that made me a jazz fan.
Yeah, I kind of have difficulty with those questions too. When someone asks me what's your favorite, there's so many things that I like and I'm involved with for a long time, and then I move on to something else. And I hate those questions like, "What's your 10 desert island albums?"
Yeah.
It's a tough one.
Yeah, I don't think. Well, I could name a couple of desert island albums.
Yeah.
It would definitely be the Miles Davis, Gil Evans, Porgy and Bess, which when I first heard, I was just gobsmacked. It chokes me up just talking about it. To say nothing of the fact that it has the all-time sexiest album cover ever photographed. That would certainly be one. And after this is over and I go home, I'll think of some others. But yeah.
So I'm curious. Again, this is totally off the rails from the questions that I had prepared, but learning more things about this, I want to ask now. So in New York City, seeing bands live, you mentioned you saw John Coltrane. Was this the quartet with Jimmy Harrison and Elvin?
Yeah, the Train Quartet. He played Favorite Things for his entire set, and they were running about 45 minutes at that time. And after about that amount of time, Pee Wee Marcotte got up there, and let's hear it for the great John Coltrane, ladies and gentlemen. And he took the sax out of his mouth and looked down at Pee Wee. It was the most benevolent smile. There's just this wonderful smile. And then he put it back in his mouth, and he played for another 30 minutes. All Favorite Things. Yeah.
So, and you also mentioned Stan Getz. You saw in this.
Getz and
this
Gilberto, I saw there.
Bossa Nova period, then, yes.
Yeah, right. It was right after the Girl from Ipanema came out, and that was all over the airwaves that summer. And I still, the lovely and talented DeGroot is here, but she won't mind if I tell the story. When I was going with my first real girlfriend in high school, that was on the radio, and it still gives me a smile to hear it, because I always remember, sitting in the car in Echo Park with Andy, who was her name, and discussing our geometry homework.
I'm sure you heard Red sing that song on not only Bill's album but live many times when he had the feature on "Teach Me Tonight," and then the end he puts a couple lyrics about the backseat of a car at the end of the tune. on the Milk Leap. What's the name of the album? Kelly's Heroes. Kelly's
Well,
Heroes.
Kelly's Heroes, yeah. That's a great album.
Okay, so any other artists in New York that made an impression seeing them live? I mean, it sounds like you saw a lot.
Dizzy Gillespie. It was almost a who's who. I mean, we were going up there. It didn't cost much to get in, you know, almost every week. Once again, on my way home, I'll think of some other. The other place we used to go to, but we couldn't get in because they didn't have an underage place, was a place called the Metropole. But we could only stand outside, and sometimes in the middle of the winter, and you could hear, the Herman Herd was there. And I talked to Bud Shank one time, who had played in one of those bands at the Metropole, and he said the bandstand, it was right behind the bar, and it was really steeply raked, and there was a mirror on the other side, which I wasn't able to see from outside. You could look through the window, and see them all. And he said it would just give you vertigo, to look at this mirror. But every once in a while, the door would open, people would go in and out. And, we were 15, 16-year-old guys. And that door would open, and out this giant puff would come wafting out of cigarette smoke and booze and sweat and perfume. And it just smelled like heaven to us, We said, wow, it was the most grown-up smell we could imagine. We so wanted to get in there. And we go to the Vanguard or the Gate as well. One of those you could get in underage, or you could fake your way in. And I saw some players there, but now I'm drawing a blank about who I saw.
Oh, that's all right. So all I wanted to ask you, again, this just came up just while listening to you talk about these things. So you grew up seeing some of the best jazz, well, I mean, it's depending on who you talk to, but some great jazz artists in their prime, live in New York City. Yeah. And since that time, been a radio DJ and been around several concerts, working for KPLU, who's produced a lot of concerts, now KNKX. So you've seen, where I'm going with this is you've seen the music industry at the ground level from the club side of things and from concert halls, the economic side of it, not necessarily having to deal with it as a musician, but as a concert goer. And you've also made friends with lots of musicians over the years. I'm curious as to your opinion about the current state of affairs with the music scene. And I don't mean now during COVID, because obviously we're sheltering in place, but it seems to me, talking with older musicians, that the live music scene was much healthier and economically stable, much more 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago than it is in 2020. From your experience and things that you've seen, would you say that that's a fair assessment, or what are your opinions about that?
I'm not really qualified to have an opinion on that. I've never really known too much about that side of the music scene. I don't know that there was ever a golden age. From what little I know, musicians and recording artists have been getting ripped off one way or another, right from the start. I remember talking with Mose Allison one time at Jazz Alley in between sets, and he was saying, he said, that's why you got to write stuff. You can get the composer credit. They can't rip you off on that. And I don't think it's any secret. From what little I know, and you might know better than I do, maybe now that musicians are bypassing record companies, maybe they're getting paid more honestly now. I honestly don't know. But it's always been yeah.
I think it's a tough one now. I mean, yes, we have, with the advent of the home computer and the internet and all that kind of stuff, you can make your music and make it much more readily available to the audience. But if you are trying to use something like Spotify or Apple Music or even Tidal, like these places that are kind of a gateway to selling your music, the revenue is not awesome, as you probably may have heard or are aware.
Yeah.
So, okay. So you were in New York, and then forget the timeline here. Then you ended up in Alaska, and then Tacoma. What brought you to Tacoma? Why Tacoma?
Well, as I mentioned, I'd been doing this telephone talk show for 5 years, and I just finally had it. It was just taking too much of a toll on me. And the woman I was with at the time, who later became my wife, wanted to get out of Anchorage. And so we did, and we lived in a VW bus. We traveled around for a long time, living in the bus. It's a '59 bus, And eventually we'd had enough of that, and she owned a little place in Tacoma, and with her ex, and that she at that point then owned, and said, well, let's do that, and we wound up living there, and from there the chimneys and all that. There was another part of your question, but I don't remember.
What brought you to
Well, that's
Tacoma?
what brought us to Tacoma. Yeah,
Okay. And what year did you arrive here in Tacoma?
1976.
Okay. I was born in 1978, and
really?
my parents, I was born in Vancouver, Washington. My parents moved to Tacoma in 1979. So we kind of arrived on the scene roughly at the same time.
In different forms. But
Yes, yes. And I have my own opinions, as do many people, about the city. But, seeing I have many fond memories of growing up here and seeing things kind of grow and change and, good and bad, better or worse. And I'm sure you probably have your own opinions as well. Any thoughts of the city of Tacoma and its change and growth that you like or dislike from the late 70s up until now?
I've always liked Tacoma. I've always been proud to live in Tacoma. I've always sneered at those who sneered at Tacoma. And, we live in East Tacoma. We're not even in a trendy neighborhood or anything. And I'm so glad that, especially now, that I do live in Tacoma, that we do live in Tacoma. And I'm all for a great city. If I have any qualms about Tacoma, it's the colonizers that are moving in here and driving prices up and so forth. That's as political as I want.
Yeah, no, I'm with you, and we'll stay clear of that kind of stuff. But the other thing that, if we're talking about bones to pick with the city, the I-5 corridor that connects to Highway 16, that's been under construction for forever. And
yeah.
But speaking of positive things, I have several things about the city that I like, maybe well-known or lesser-known that I really enjoy. And are there any restaurants or locations or things that you really enjoy about the city that really, make you feel, besides just having pride for the city, but things that you really enjoy or, on your things to do?
Well, I think Tacoma has wonderful parks. We love to go to parks, to Point Defiance, and what's that one where we always walk around the lake there? Wapato, and there's beautiful parks in Tacoma. You can always find a place to park in Tacoma. Speaking of parks, there's some good restaurants we love to go to. There's a great Mexican restaurant near where we live called Viva a la Vida. We just call it the Octopus because there's a picture of an octopus in his sombrero, who I've always thought looks like Tito Puente. But of course, we can't go to restaurants so much anymore. But those are two that we love. We loved Primo on 6th Avenue, and a few other places. There's a great pho place up on Pacific near Tweez Pho. So there's some good restaurants. Yeah, not as many or as fancy as Seattle, but I hate to go to Seattle. We don't go unless we absolutely have to, for some kind of business or whatever. I like to stay right here in Tacoma.
I can remember starting to play more professionally in high school, 16, 17, and driving up to Seattle to do usually big band gigs, Tuxedo Junction with Bill Ramsey and Tracy Knope and all these guys. And I remember the traffic used to take, you could assume, anywhere between 30 to 45 minutes in the late 90s. And now
forget it.
You could be driving home from a gig, well, not right now, but prior to sheltering in place on a Sunday night, getting done at 8 o'clock and still get stuck in traffic for 2 hours.
It can take you 2 hours once you're in Seattle just to get to where you're going. I've been on Tracy Knope since the Red Kelly days, now I'm going to get on you too. I have always thought that the old Woody Woodpecker song would make a great bebop number. And
you're in luck because Woody Shaw recorded it, and it's on one of his albums.
No.
Yes, he did.
Really?
It's on, I think the album is Imagination. I think the record label is like 32 Jazz. I have it. If you can't find it, let me know.
I bet I can find it. I'm going to find it.
But he did it, and it's
you
great.
And Tracy are off the hook now.
Well, I can't hold a candle to Woody Shaw, but we can cover it one of these days. We'll do it for you. So I'm not going to ask about Janine. You covered that wonderfully in the TNT article. So if anyone wants to know about the story with what's the deal with Dick Stein and Janine, just read the article in the Tacoma News Tribune. It explains all. Okay, well, let's see. What else did I want to ask you here? I've got a couple of the questions here. So we talked about jazz albums. What are now in 2020, you've interacted with so many different artists and jazz personalities. Who are some, I won't ask like some favorites, but what are some memorable characters that stick out in your mind that you really enjoyed spending time with them over the years?
Well, I never really have gotten to spend that much time. Probably the most time I ever spent with anyone was with Mose Allison that time, and I had loved him since I was a teenager, and actually was surprised. It was years before I realized that you could actually go and see this guy, and at the Jazz Alley was the first time I'd ever seen him live. Once again, on my way home, I'm going to think of all kinds of people. I've always enjoyed. We did a lot of live studio sessions with Karen Allison, and that was always fun chatting with her. She told a great Marion McPartland story too, right on the air. Would you like to hear that? It's
of course, yes.
It was shortly after Marion passed away, and she was telling the story. I think it was at a concert of some kind, in an outdoor, a festival kind of thing. And she was getting set to go on stage, and Marianne was back there, and so was Karen's partner, Bill McLaughlin. And he gave her, a hug and a kiss, go get him, honey, kind of thing. And Marianne was there, and Karen told us, right, live on the air, she said, "Oh, my dear, you're so lovely. I'd fall upon you myself, but it's not my week for girls." Here's another great one. Janice Siegel from Manhattan Transfer. We were on the air. I was doing an interview. They were promoting a new record, and they were in town and all that. And she was great. She was a real live wire. And somehow we got on to Cole Porter, and she said, I know the unknown lyrics to Cole Porter's "You're the Tops." And I said, "Oh, I got to hear it." She said, "These are the forbidden lyrics." She was really funny. I said, "How'd it go?" And she sang it. And she went, I did an edited version of this at another time, but she sang it. She said, "You're the top, you're the armless Venus, you're the tip of King Kong's penis." And right after that, she said, "This is recorded, right? We're not on the air." I said, "Oh, no, we're live." We're live.
Well, we're doing these broadcasts for educational purposes, and this is historical context, so it's okay. This is not, lewd bar talk. We can do that later. So, all right. Well, we talked about food briefly a moment ago, and I'm sure some people watching would kill me if I didn't ask. So, can you talk a little bit about how Food for Thought came into play and your role with that?
Well, I'd done a food show prior to that for a couple of years called Jazz Kitchen, and some of it was pretty straight ahead interviews with chefs and the recipes and all that. But some of the other stuff was just really crazy stuff that I would just produce. Like a show about rotisserie chicken on nuclear fuel rods and the strange stuff that was growing in the FDA-condemned refrigerator I'd bought up cheap, and so on. And then that was over, and it was over for about a year. And they got Nancy Leson to do a food show. She was doing a show on the station, but after a while she said, I can't do this alone. I need someone else to do it with. And we had never met at that time, but we had sort of been mutual fans. I'd dropped her an email one time. At that time, she was doing the restaurant review for the Seattle Times, and she had written some column that I really liked, and I just, hey, that was a great column. I always enjoyed reading your column, blah, blah, blah. And she wrote back and said, "Oh, my God, I can't believe it. Dick Stein, I love listening to your show." So after she had been doing that by herself, and said, "I need somebody else," they asked me, would you want to, do something with her? And I said, well, we'll give it a try. And I don't really remember if we did like a demo thing or anything like that. But that was the provenance of it. And then we went on to do that. I don't know, like 14 years of those shows,
I had another question I wanted to ask you.
Oh, and now it can be told, probably not generally known. Nancy and I were only in the same room probably no more than 3 or 4 times a year. Those shows were all done, with a broadcast quality phone connection.
Wow. Crazy.
Yeah.
And now in 2020, I mean, here we are filming this on a phone, for God's sakes.
Yeah, we got a lot of practice now.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you, first I should let our viewers know we're at that time here. So if anybody has any questions for myself or Dick, feel free to write things in the comments, and we'll open those up as soon as we can. So if you have anything you want to ask about, now is your chance, and we'll get to them if we can here. I was going to ask you, with comedy, it seems like, you can divide a room with British comedy, like Monty Python. You either love it or hate it. Eggnog, you either love it or hate it. Comedy is a very particular thing. And depending on people's tastes in comedy, that also becomes a part of who they are as a person, how they interact with the world. I wanted to ask you, with your just general sense of being as a human and how you interact with people, and when you talk on the air, a lot of people find you hilarious. I'm one of them. Do you have you patterned yourself after anyone? Do you enjoy live comedy or stand-up comics? Do you watch any of that kind of stuff, or just that's just naturally who you are?
Not very much. I think there's more bad comedy, than there is almost bad anything else. I used to love. I can't say that I patterned myself after anyone at all. There were people,
or anyone you had enjoyed, comics that you enjoyed over the years.
Well, to go way back, I would say Bob and Ray, I just loved them. I still think they were hilarious, and they were, you say gentle humor, and he's thinking, how funny could it be? But I thought they were hilarious, and they were never mean. There was never anything mean about what Bob and Ray did, but it was still side-splitting, routines like Slow Talkers of America or the Komodo Dragon interview. People, if you don't know these, look them up. You can find them on the web. Probably my biggest storytelling influence was Gene Shepard, who did a show on in New York from 10:15 to 11, WOR, and he would just tell stories. And he was an incredible storyteller. And I found out recently that Jerry Seinfeld was also a big Gene Shepard fan. So those guys, I loved Ernie Kovacs, who was not a stand-up guy at all. I mean, I could think of definitely some stand-up people I liked a lot. And then later in the way of produced comedy, definitely Firesign Theater. But I don't think I've done anything quite like them. I hope I always wanted to just do my own thing. I don't think that we can exist in the world without having been influenced in some way. But I couldn't say so-and-so was, I never wanted to model myself after anyone.
Yeah, well, it just seems like, like for me, when I'm doing a concert, one of the least favorite things is talking on the microphone. Playing is not a problem. Talking, I mean, I can do it. I've learned to do it because I have to out of necessity, but I don't like it. I don't enjoy it. When I listen to you and now here talking with you, it just seems to go effortlessly, like without much thought, without much preparation. Not that it's always very good. It's very personable and humorous, and I think that's one of the things that people enjoy or have enjoyed about your work over the years. It just seems to just come. That's just part of who you are. And I was just curious how that came to be. If there was, some people, like a lot of comedians, listen to other comedians and they obviously have their own style, but out of that you can kind of see traces of this or that, and that's why I was just curious. Well,
yeah, I mean, there's certainly been lots of comedians that I've enjoyed very much listening to, but I most of the stuff I've done over on the air, other than produced plays, the Jimmy Jazzoid plays and stuff, it's just been off the top of my head. Sometimes on the air I jot something down. I'd get good one. I'll forget it if I don't jot it down, a line or a gag or an observation or whatever. But honest, most of the stuff I've done has just been off the top of my head.
Like most jazz musicians, it's improvising.
Yeah, just improvise whatever popped into my head.
Well, one of the questions I had here was, are your jokes spontaneous? And what I'm hearing you say is yes, but if you think it's one that's really great, you will jot it down later on so you don't forget it.
Well, I don't think I ever did told an actual joke on the air. It takes too long. And I always, my mental image of the listener, I didn't really have one, but was, they're sitting there drumming their fingers, waiting for you to get to the point and play some more music. So I always like to be brief and succinct on the air. So anything that I was going to do that would be funny would be just something in passing, a little aside, a little quickie, a gag or whatever. I always try to keep it brief. So yeah.
So people have asked about Janine, and you explained that in great length in the TNT article. But can you talk about the big red button? What is the history of the big red button?
The big red switch. Yeah, there really was a big red switch in the original KPLU studios on the PLU campus. It was just this narrow little room, and the mic and the board equipment and stuff was on one end, and then there was a rack on the other that had all the, flashing lights and stuff, which I always suspected were not connected to anything, But right in the middle of it, there was a big red switch. It was a button, really, a square red button, probably at least 1.5 inches square, and there was a clear plastic safety guard over it, like over a fire alarm. And there was a big label maker label in capital letters that said no, capital letters with an exclamation point. So that always intrigued me. I always wondered what that thing was about. And I started on the air early on. I started saying, it's Dick Stein behind the big red switch that says no. And eventually that just got shortened to the big red switch.
Okay, good. Well, that puts that question.
Now it can be told.
All right. Well, you don't have to answer this question if you don't want to. I'm curious about your thoughts and opinions about the transition from KPLU to KNKX and all of the shenanigans or lack of shenanigans that went on. What are your feelings about that transition and how that all unfolded?
We received news of that from the PLU administration. They called a meeting to give us the news about 1 hour before it was made public in a press release. We were really shocked. I really don't know how much I want to say about that, because I have very strong feelings about that, and about the way the university handled that. Which I guess I can say anything I want to, can't I? I mean, they basically were trying to sell us off for parts, and I don't want to say any more about that. What I will say, let's look at the positive side of it. There was such an outcry from our listeners that, as is well known, we were able to raise $7 million in a very short amount of time to buy our independence. And we were overwhelmed at the outpouring of love from listeners. And, I don't think that would have happened with many other public radio stations. And I think it happened with us, with KPLU, now KNKX, because we were a lot different, I think, and still are, than public radio generally is, in every way across the board. I think we were a lot more human. We are a lot more real. I used to say our slogan, and they would never return my emails to Joey, our manager, was public radio without the corn cob. I'll say no more. You can draw your own conclusions. And I think because of that, people thought of us as friends, and we think of our listeners as friends. I sure do. And I've developed relationships over the years with people I've never met. Email, this one guy named Drew that used to send me these awful jokes, these little one-liner jokes that I would use, but only if they were really bad. And lots of other people that I've corresponded with over the years. And so, yeah, we've had a very special relationship with our listeners, and because of that, we were able to, to save ourselves. And, I think it turned out to be a real blessing in disguise. Now we're downtown in Tacoma. Of course, nobody's been able to use the studios for quite a while.
It's pristine.
Yeah, they're pristine. We'll be back. I'll still say we, even though I'm retired now. I'm still a supporter of the station, and I hope to do something now and then on the air again.
Well, I think the public rallying. Do we have questions? Oh, we've got questions. To be continued. What do we have? What are our questions?
What makes you optimistic about the future of jazz if you are optimistic?
So the question is, what makes you optimistic about the future of jazz if you are optimistic?
I guess I'm optimistic I think a lot of exciting stuff is being done in the music, and I think it's evolving as it always has. I guess if I'm optimistic based on history. Once jazz no longer became danceable, for the most part, it used to be America's popular music. It was jazz music. Once movements like bebop, which, as I said, I love, and all that came in, it no longer became possible really to dance to jazz, and it lost a lot of audience. But there's always been, whatever the percentage is, of people like me as a kid and today, young kids, that love jazz. And I see no reason why that percentage of listeners, which is probably very small, is ever going to change from one generational cohort to another. And I think even kids today will discover the music, I hope, through what they hear on KNKX and what they find out about on their own. Stuff that's being played today that's modern, as opposed to modern jazz, whatever that was. And also going way back into the history of the music, because I love all periods of the music, and I don't really think of one period as being superior to another. It's just different. So if I'm optimistic, that's what I'm optimistic about. The same small percentage of people will become jazz lovers, just as they always have. So,
Other questions?
How do you decide what to play on a particular evening, and what are you listening to now?
So the question's two parts. How do you decide to play on a particular evening, and what are you currently listening to?
well, I didn't play on evenings. When I was playing evenings, we had a playlist. We used to vote on it, new records and stuff like that, what we wanted to play. So part of it is really taken care of. For the last number of years, I've been more of a presenter than a selector. I would say, I don't want to play that. I'll play this. I'd run out to the CDs at the record library and put something else in, and put in stuff. But it's more of a group effort these days. Even when I started out in radio, in college radio, which I'd tell a funny story about that.
Please do.
I was doing a show. It was on WERS at Emerson College in Boston, and it was called Sibelius Cycle. And my entire time on the air, I would say, it would open up. I would say, I would do this really, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Sibelius Cycle on WERS. This evening's selection is, and then I'd put on 4 sides of a Sibelius LP, and then when it was over, you've been listening to Sibelius Cycle, So that was it. And I was like this 19-year-old guy on the radio. I want to do something. So the teletype, one evening while it was playing, the bells go off in the teletype, which meant a bulletin, important news bulletin coming in. Ran back, tore it off, and Herbert Hoover had died. Okay? Well, there's a famous story about Herbert Hoover. It was an announcer by the name of Harry Von Zell, who I think might have been the announcer for the Burns and Allen show. It doesn't matter. But there was a famous radio blooper of Harry Von Zell attempting to say Herbert Hoover and saying Hebert Hooper, or something like that. And I was very much aware of that. And I said, this is big news. Herbert Hoover has died. I've got to break in, and the people must know. Even then, he hadn't been president for like 40 years, So, but I kept saying, I've got to get it right. Herbert Hoover, Herbert Hoover, Herbert Hoover. And I broke into the music. We interrupt this program to bring you a news bulletin from the Associated Press. Ex-President Herbert Hoover, yes, has just died of what doctors termed a massive hemorrhoid. This is the truth. I literally, physically reached out to try to pull the words back, but you couldn't do that. They wouldn't come back. And I said, and now we return to Sibelius Cycle. Like 1 minute later, the Mr. Kroger, who was with his voice, and I'm on the phone rings, and I go, oh, God, Mr. Stein. So, yeah, I don't even know how we got onto that, but true story.
Other questions?
What makes a jazz vocalist memorable?
The question is, what makes a jazz vocalist memorable? I'm assuming this is memorable to Dick Stein.
Yeah, to me, are they good storytellers? And I think that's what makes any vocalist memorable. Are they telling the story? Because a lot of songs are really stories. I always thought Carmen McRae was a great example of that. One of probably my favorite living vocalist, Karen Allison, is very good at that. You're hearing a story, when they're singing. I always loved John Hendricks, his vocal. He did one called "Give Me That Wine" with Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross. It's a real story. I mean, it's a silly story, about the lengths that this character would go. And in a way, sometimes the singer is inhabiting a persona. Randy Newman caught all kinds of flack for so many songs that he wrote, but it wasn't Randy Newman telling the story, singing the song. It was this character that he'd invented. So yes, are they telling the story? Are they really making you hear the story and understand, share the emotion, that's being expressed? We used to get all these records, demo records at the station, and we'll never forget this one that came in from this guy. I couldn't remember his name. It wouldn't matter anyway. But he did a rendition of a great Harry Warren song, "The Boulevard of Broken Dreams." And the greatest version I've ever heard was done by Marianne Faithfull, who I think spent her whole life getting to the point where, this primal scream. Well, this guy did a recording of "Boulevard of Broken Dreams," and it was like this cheap lounge. I walk along the street of sorrow. Oh, yeah. And I mean, this is song, "Boulevard of Broken Dreams," and this guy completely missed the point of the story. And I think that a good vocalist understands the song and knows what the point of the story is and performs it accordingly.
Well, we are at that time. I could barrage you with questions for several more hours, which you probably wouldn't enjoy, neither would your lovely wife. But in closing, number one, thank you to our viewers for watching. Glad to be able to do this for you. Thank you, Dick Stein, for joining us. It's been a pleasure. And before you go, I just want to say, we were talking about KNKX being saved, which is by the community in such a short amount of time, which is unprecedented with many radio stations. I would say that speaks to KNKX's character, your character, for being such a huge part of that for so many years. And as I said at the start of this, just from myself and from the community, we love you and thank you so much for all that you've done for us. And we've got the 2020, COVID-19, sheltering in place, murder hornets, and smoke and fires, and now it almost feels like a death in the family. Dick Stein no longer on the air, which it sucks for a lot of us. So we think the world of you, and thank you so much for everything you've done.
Well, thank you so much. Very, very moving. And, since everybody liked me so much, maybe I should...
Four more years.
Yeah. Oh, Jesus. We were having such a good time.
All right. I will shut off the camera. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll be doing the live stream concert here in about a little over an hour, so stick around. Thank you.
Bye, folks.